The transformation of Frederick the Great, from tragedy to triumph. In the pre-dawn hours of August 15, 1730, a terrified 18-year-old prince watched as soldiers dragged away his closest friend to face execution. The young man's crime: helping Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia attempt to flee his father's brutal court. As Hans Hermann von Katte walked to the scaffold, Frederick himself remained imprisoned in the fortress of Küstrin, forced by his father to watch his friend's beheading from his cell window. This savage lesson in obedience, meant to break Frederick's spirit, would instead forge the complex character of Europe's most remarkable monarch, a man who would transform a backwater kingdom into a continental superpower through an extraordinary combination of Enlightenment philosophy and ruthless ambition. This is the story of how a poetry-loving prince who once attempted suicide became Old Fritz, the battle-hardened ruler who led his armies from the front, played the flute after victories, corresponded with Voltaire between campaigns, and built a modern state from the mud of Brandenburg. It is a tale of personal redemption and national destiny, where a kingdom of 2 million would stand against the combined might of Europe's great powers and emerge as their equal. Frederick the Great's Prussia would become the anvil upon which modern Germany was forged, and his legacy would echo through the centuries to come. The rise of Frederick the Great, philosopher and warrior. On a bitter morning in May 1740, Frederick stood before his father's deathbed in the Potsdam Palace. Frederick William Burns, the Soldier King, had spent decades building Europe's most disciplined army while treating his own son as a failed recruit. Now, as the old king's breath rattled in his chest, he looked up at the son he had once condemned to death for attempting desertion. "If you rule unjustly," he wheezed, "may my curse follow you to the grave." Hours later, Frederick II became King of Prussia, inheriting a kingdom with the continent's 4th largest army, but only its 13th largest population. The new king's subjects might have expected their ruler to waste his father's military legacy. After all, this was a prince who wrote anti-Machiavellian treatises, composed French poetry, and gathered Europe's leading philosophers for his famous evening salons. His closest friend was Voltaire, not a general. His private library held more books on music than military science. Yet within 6 months of taking the throne, Frederick would shock Europe by revealing himself as something far more dangerous than either a warrior king like his father or the gentle philosopher his friends expected. He was both. On December 16, 1740, without a declaration of war, Frederick's armies crossed the Silesian border. The wealthy Austrian province had been left vulnerable by the death of Emperor Charles VI and the contested succession of his daughter, Maria Theresa. While Vienna's diplomats were still arguing over whether a woman could inherit the Habsburg throne, Frederick's battalions were already seizing Silesian fortresses. The invasion was launched with his father's army, but led with his own tactical brilliance. When his generals hesitated before the Austrian forces at the Battle of Mollwitz, Frederick demonstrated both his initial inexperience and his quick learning. After fleeing the battlefield early in the fight, believing all was lost, he returned to discover his troops had won through their superior discipline and training. He would never doubt his army again. By the summer of 1741, most of Silesia lay in Prussian hands. Frederick's gamble had paid off spectacularly, but it came at the cost of his carefully cultivated image as an enlightened prince. His former friend Voltaire would later write, "The King of Prussia seized Silesia first, and then looked in his library for justification. Yet Frederick was untroubled by the criticism. He had revealed himself as a new kind of monarch, one who could quote Plato while planning campaigns, who wrote essays on good governance while conquering provinces. He would later confide to his brother, "Politics is the art of serving God in such a way that the devil doesn't get angry." In seizing Silesia, he had served both masters well, launching a series of wars that would transform Prussia from a minor kingdom into a European power. As 1741 drew to a close, Frederick could already sense the storm gathering. Maria Theresa would not easily surrender her richest province, and Prussia's meteoric rise had alarmed every major power in Europe. The philosopher king would soon need to prove himself a warrior, and the army he inherited from his father would face its greatest test. But for now, Frederick retired each evening to his music room at Sans-Souci, where he played his beloved flute and perhaps reflected on how far he had come from that imprisoned prince at Küstrin, watching his best friend die. The real trials were still to come. Blood and Glory, Frederick the Great and the Silesian Wars. Maria Theresa's fury at Frederick's betrayal transformed the young Habsburg Empress. While her advisors wrung their hands and suggested concessions, she rallied her Hungarian nobles with a masterful display of political theatre. Holding her infant son in her arms, she appealed to their ancient loyalty, and the Magyar warriors responded with their famous cry, "Let us die for our king, Maria Theresa." By spring 1742, Austrian armies were pouring into Silesia, determined to punish the upstart Prussian king. At Chotusitz, Frederick faced his first real test as a battlefield commander. The Austrians attacked at dawn, their cavalry smashing into the Prussian lines while smoke from burning villages obscured the field. Frederick, positioned on a small hill, watched his center begin to crumble. But instead of retreating, he galloped directly into the chaos, rallying his infantry for a counterattack. The Prussian discipline held. Their volleys, fired with mechanical precision, devastated the Austrian ranks. When his cavalry commander hesitated to charge, Frederick personally led the assault that broke the Austrian army. That evening, as his surgeons tended to the wounded, Frederick pulled out his flute and played a victory concert for his officers. The Second Silesian War proved even bloodier. In 1744, Frederick's armies were caught in a deadly trap in Bohemia. Supply lines cut, troops starving, retreat seemed inevitable. Yet Frederick managed to extract his army through a brilliant feint that drew the Austrians away from their blocking position. The campaign culminated in December 1745 at the Battle of Kesselsdorf, where Old Dessauer, Leopold Brun of Anhalt-Dessau, led the Prussian forces to a decisive victory that finally secured Silesia. The cost had been staggering, nearly 150,000 dead on all sides. But Prussia had emerged as a great power. In the decade of peace that followed, Frederick transformed his army. Every aspect of warfare was analyzed, codified, and drilled into his troops. His infantry could fire 4 shots per minute, nearly double the rate of their rivals. His cavalry was retrained to charge at full gallop, sabers drawn in thunder-run attacks that would become legendary. He wrote military manuals that would be studied for centuries, while simultaneously penning philosophical treatises on good governance. Yet even as he built his forces, Frederick sensed a greater storm approaching. His seizure of Silesia had not been forgotten, and Prussia's rivals were forming a coalition that would test his kingdom to its very limits. By 1756, the diplomatic web was complete. France, Austria, Russia, Saxony, and Sweden had allied against Prussia. 5 of Europe's greatest powers were determined to partition Frederick's kingdom. The population ratio stood at 20-1 against Prussia. Looking at these odds, Frederick's minister, Graf von Finckenstein, asked how they could possibly survive. Frederick's response captured the essence of his leadership. "We will outmaneuver them, defeat them in detail, and make our enemies fear us more than they hate us." The 7 Years' War was about to begin, and with it, the greatest test of Frederick's reign. Prussia's survival, the 7 Years' War, and its aftermath. On August 29, 1756, Frederick struck first. Without warning, his armies poured into Saxony, capturing Dresden and bottling up the Saxon army in a masterful encirclement at Pirna. The preemptive strike stunned Europe, but it was only the beginning. Armies were mobilizing from St. Petersburg to Paris, all converging on Prussia. Frederick would need to fight on multiple fronts, racing his armies back and forth across Central Europe to meet each threat in turn. The odds seemed impossible. Prussia's population of 5 million faced enemies totaling 100 million. The early victories at Lobositz and Prague bolstered Prussian confidence, but then came Cologne. On June 18, 1757, Frederick's trademark oblique attack failed catastrophically against Austrian Marshal Daun's prepared positions. The Prussian army, previously thought invincible, lost 14,000 men in a single day. Frederick himself was nearly captured, his golden snuff box stopping an enemy bullet. As he watched his soldiers retreat, he reportedly screamed, "Dogs, do you want to live forever?" It was his first major defeat, and it opened the floodgates. Russians invaded from the east, French from the west, Swedes from the north. Berlin itself was briefly occupied and ransacked. The darkest hour came in 1759. After the catastrophic defeat at Kunersdorf, where the combined Russian and Austrian armies nearly destroyed the Prussian force, Frederick carried a vial of poison in his pocket. He wrote to his minister, "All is lost. Save the royal family and the state archives. Farewell forever." Yet even as he contemplated suicide, his enemy's lack of coordination gave him precious time to recover. The Russians and Austrians, suspicious of each other, failed to press their advantage. Frederick would later call this the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. By 1761, Prussia was on its last legs. The army had lost 180,000 men, irreplaceable veterans replaced by hastily trained recruits. The treasury was empty, the countryside ravaged. Frederick aged visibly, his hair turning white, his face deeply lined. He wrote bitter poetry in French about the burden of kingship and the futility of war. Then came the second miracle. Empress Elizabeth of Russia died, and her successor Peter III, a passionate admirer of Frederick, immediately switched sides. The sudden reversal saved Prussia. Though Peter was quickly overthrown, the damage to the anti-Prussian coalition was done. The war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Hubertusburg. Prussia had survived, keeping Silesia and emerging as Europe's newest great power. But the cost had been devastating. Over 500,000 dead, provinces in ruins, and a king forever changed. Frederick, once the enlightened philosopher prince, had become a harder, more cynical man. "The world," he wrote, "does not reward merit, but success." The 23 years of peace that followed would test whether he could rebuild his shattered kingdom while maintaining the military might that had saved it. The greatest challenge of his reign was over, but his most lasting achievement still lay ahead. Frederick the Great, the enlightened despot. In the quiet of his study at Sans-Souci, surrounded by his beloved greyhounds, Frederick drafted a document that would revolutionize European justice. The Frederician Code abolished torture, established religious tolerance, and created Europe's first professional civil service. Yet the same hand that penned these enlightened reforms also signed orders maintaining serfdom and absolute royal power. This was Frederick in his mature phase, the enlightened despot who believed that only an iron fist could deliver golden results. His bureaucratic innovations transformed Prussia into Europe's most efficiently governed state. Each morning at 4 a.m., Frederick would rise to read every important document, scrawling marginal notes in his distinctive hand. Nonsense. Investigate this fool. Help these people immediately. His civil servants learned to fear his penetrating questions and savage wit. When one minister complained about the difficulty of collecting taxes in a war-ravaged province, Frederick responded with characteristic sarcasm. If collecting taxes was easy, I wouldn't need intelligent ministers to do it. Yet his administrators also knew that competence would be rewarded regardless of birth. Frederick was perhaps Europe's first true meritocrat. The new Prussia was a strange hybrid that left foreign visitors both impressed and unsettled. In Berlin, one could attend Italian opera, French theatre, and philosophical debates, then walk past squares where sergeants drilled recruits with mechanical precision. Frederick poured money into the Academy of Sciences while maintaining Europe's largest army per capita. He wrote essays defending freedom of thought while censoring the press. When questioned about these contradictions, he simply said, "I am the first servant of the state." It was a revolutionary concept, the king not as owner of his realm, but as its chief administrator. Frederick's religious tolerance stood out in an age of persecution. All religions must be tolerated, he declared, for every man must get to heaven in his own way. Jews received unprecedented rights. Catholics built churches in Protestant areas, and Jesuits found refuge when they were expelled from other Catholic countries. Yet this tolerance had practical aims. More diversity meant more skilled workers and merchants. Frederick saw religion as he saw everything else, a tool for strengthening the state. His personal atheism remained private, expressed only in his correspondence with Voltaire. By 1770, Prussia had become Europe's most modern state, with a professional bureaucracy, codified laws, and religious freedom. Yet it was also a military machine where every aspect of society was organized to support the army. Each district had to provide specific numbers of recruits. Each province had to maintain grain reserves for wartime. Each road was built with military transport in mind. Frederick had created something entirely new, an enlightened absolutism that combined French culture, German efficiency, and Prussian discipline. The model would influence reformers and revolutionaries for generations to come, though few would understand its essential paradox. Only through absolute power could progressive reforms be achieved. Frederick the Great, Prussia's agricultural and economic revolution. The king's carriage rolled through Brandenburg's sandy plains, stopping at each village. To the peasants' astonishment, Frederick himself inspected their fields, not for military readiness, but for something seemingly mundane: potatoes. The American tuber, still viewed with suspicion by European farmers, had become Frederick's obsession. In a letter to his minister, he wrote, "The war had shown me that my people starve too easily. Thus, I wage a new campaign, not with muskets, but with spades." When peasants resisted planting the unfamiliar crop, Frederick posted guards around potato fields, knowing the farmers would steal and plant the forbidden vegetables. It worked. His agricultural revolution transformed Prussia's landscape. Dutch experts drained swamps, turning useless marshes into fertile farmland. Prussian engineers built canals connecting major rivers, creating a transportation network that slashed food prices. Frederick imported Spanish merino sheep to improve wool production, established silk farms by planting millions of mulberry trees, and offered free land to anyone willing to farm it, including foreigners, criminals, and religious refugees. The population exploded, growing from 2.4 million to 6 million during his reign. Frederick applied military precision to reconstruction. Each village had quotas, not just for recruits, but for new farms, workshops, and schools. Royal inspectors graded local officials on their development progress, with rewards for success and harsh penalties for failure. When one noble complained about peasants being taught to read, Frederick snapped back, "Educated farmers grow more food." He established Prussia's first veterinary school, understanding that healthy livestock meant prosperous farms. The same drill sergeants who trained soldiers were now teaching farmers modern cultivation techniques. Behind this transformation lay Frederick's evolving philosophy of power. His early wars had shown him that military might alone couldn't sustain a great power. Economic strength was essential. He turned his tactical genius to economic warfare, using tariffs and subsidies like he once used battalions and squadrons. When Austria tried to strangle Prussian trade, Frederick built new roads to bypass their territories. When merchants hoarded grain, he opened royal storehouses to crash the price. His commercial treaties were as carefully crafted as his military alliances. By 1780, Prussia had changed beyond recognition. The backwards corner of Europe that Frederick inherited had become its most innovative state. Forest villages had grown into manufacturing towns, swamps into farmland, peasants into prosperous farmers. Yet Frederick remained restless. Each morning he still rode out to inspect some project, stopping to talk with farmers about crop rotation or craftsmen about production techniques. In his pocket notebook, beside military observations, he would scribble things like "Northern slope needs terracing" or "Village needs new grain mill." The warrior king had become Europe's most successful developer, though he kept one eye always on the horizon, watching for threats to his life's work. Prussia's transformation had brought new opportunities and new dangers. The partition of Poland, Frederick the Great's diplomatic masterpiece. In the winter of 1769, Frederick received an intriguing letter from Catherine the Great of Russia. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, their mutual neighbor, was collapsing into civil war. Catherine proposed something unprecedented, a coordinated dismemberment of Poland by its three powerful neighbors. Frederick, reading the letter by candlelight, recognized both the opportunity and the danger. "The Tsarena's claws are sharp," he wrote to his brother, "and if we don't take our share, she will take it all." The ensuing diplomatic dance was Frederick's masterpiece. Playing Russia against Austria, each fearful of the other gaining too much, he positioned Prussia as the essential mediator. His diplomatic notes, written in his characteristically precise French, flattered Catherine's imperial ambitions while soothing Maria Theresa's Catholic conscience. When the Austrian Empress protested the immorality of dismembering a sovereign nation, Frederick wryly noted, "She weeps, but she takes." The first partition of Poland in 1772 gave Prussia the strategic province of Royal Prussia, minus Danzig, connecting East Prussia with Brandenburg and securing control of the Vistula River's trade. Frederick moved with characteristic efficiency to integrate the new territories. Polish nobles who resisted Prussian authority found their lands confiscated and redistributed to German settlers. Yet he also preserved Polish local institutions that proved useful and protected Catholic rights. His administrators drained marshes, built roads, and established schools, applying the same modernizing techniques that had transformed Brandenburg. The new provinces quickly became as productive as any in Prussia. The Polish acquisition reflected Frederick's mature strategic thinking. Rather than conquering through expensive wars, he had achieved his aims through diplomacy and administrative skill. The contrast with his youthful invasion of Silesia couldn't be sharper. "In my old age," he wrote to Voltaire, "I find that moving borders on maps costs less than moving armies across them." Yet he maintained his military strength, knowing that diplomacy without force was mere begging. His army remained Europe's most professional force, even as he used it primarily as a diplomatic tool. As Frederick entered his final years, the Polish partition completed Prussia's transformation from a scattered collection of territories into a coherent state stretching across northern Germany. His kingdom now controlled the Baltic trade routes and possessed defensible borders. More importantly, Prussia had demonstrated its diplomatic weight. No major European decision could be made without consulting Berlin. The old king, his face now deeply lined, his back bent from decades of riding with his troops, could look out from Sans Souci and see an achievement even greater than his military victories: the creation of a modern European power that would influence world events for centuries to come. The legacy of Frederick the Great, the last great absolute monarch. On August 17, 1786, in his favorite armchair at Sans Souci, Frederick the Great drew his final breath. The king who had cheated death on countless battlefields was finally conquered by dropsy and exhaustion at age 74. His nephew and successor, Frederick William II, found his uncle's study exactly as he had left it: diplomatic dispatches still awaiting responses, half-finished poems on his desk, and his beloved flute lying silent beside volumes of Voltaire. The old king had worked until the very end, dying as he had lived, in service to his state. A generation later, Napoleon Bonaparte would stand at Frederick's tomb in Potsdam and whisper to his generals, "Gentlemen, if this man were alive, we would not be here today." The French emperor understood what made Frederick unique. He was the last ruler to successfully combine absolute power with enlightened reform, military genius with cultural sophistication, and ruthless efficiency with philosophical wisdom. His Prussia would become the template for German unification. His military system would influence armies worldwide, and his administrative reforms would shape modern bureaucracies. Yet Frederick's greatest legacy was more subtle. He had created a new model of leadership where the ruler was the state's servant rather than its owner. His famous declaration, "I am the first servant of the state," revolutionized the concept of monarchy. Even as absolute ruler, he lived modestly, worked tirelessly, and dedicated himself completely to Prussia's advancement. His personal expenses amounted to just 1% of the state budget. When his successors rejected this model of service and returned to luxury and indulgence, they set Prussia on the path to eventual revolution. In his final years, Frederick seemed to sense the coming upheavals. His writings turned increasingly pessimistic about human nature and the future of monarchy. The American Revolution troubled him deeply, not because he opposed its principles, but because he feared Europe's rulers would prove too rigid to adapt. Just 4 years after his death, the French Revolution would begin transforming Europe. The absolute monarchy he had perfected would eventually vanish, but the efficient state he built would survive, for both good and ill. Today, Frederick's shadow still looms over modern statecraft. His fusion of power and reform, culture and militarism, efficiency and enlightenment created enduring tensions in European civilization. He showed that progress could come through authority, that culture could coexist with power, and that service could be the highest form of leadership. When he was buried in a simple ceremony at Sans-Souci, finally reunited with his beloved dogs as he had wished, an era died with him. The philosopher king had shown what absolute monarchy could achieve at its best, even as forces were gathering that would sweep it away forever.